This is the GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 188 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with renowned lecturer and garden book author Ken Druce about making more plants, or plant propagation. The plant profile is on Iphion, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with a last word on Sharing is Caring by Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Ken Druce. He is a celebrated lecturer and award-winning writer, photographer, and author of 20 garden books. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Kathy. It's great to be with you today.
Good to have you on. And I have a lot of catching up to do, Ken. I've only written 2 books. Wow, 20.
I don't know what to say.
I think you are a well-known garden writer and regular contributor to the New York Times, amongst many other things. So I think our listeners are in for a treat today as we talk about everything plant propagation and tips about how to make more plants. But before we get into that, Ken, we like to ask our guests on the GardenDC podcast, were they born with chlorophyll in their veins and a green thumb?
Yes, I was. And that's a very short answer, isn't it? My mother always would say that I got it from her, but I don't remember her gardening at all. She says that about cooking too. But I think the first thing I can remember, I was probably like maybe 4 years old, rescuing a tree that was growing in the gutter. And I always liked to play in the dirt with toy trucks and everything. So I think maybe I sculpted in soil, and then I got the super green bug.
And there's some science behind playing with soil and those microbes entering your brain stem. And maybe that said, you're going to like plants.
Oh my gosh, through my fingers?
So how did you pursue that as a career?
Well, I'm self-taught, and I went to art school because I also always drew and made art. And I have a master's degree in filmmaking. And making motion pictures is really hard. And so I got cured of that after working really hard. And then I got a job illustrating for House Beautiful magazine. And then I was made the garden editor of House Beautiful magazine. And then I thought I would do it. Well, maybe you remember when there was a glut of British books quite a long time ago. And then no one wanted to publish or sell any garden books. And then all of a sudden, a couple of garden books came out, and one of them was mine. There were really 2 garden books. I think one was Visions of Paradise, and the other one was The Natural Garden that I wrote. And they were big hits. So it kind of changed everything. And making a book is a lot like making a movie, only with fewer people to mess it up. But it really is like building a motion picture in many ways. An illustrated book.
Yeah, I love that analogy because I'm a big movie buff myself. So I'm going to have to think about that for the next book. So I think you're a very visual person.
Mm-hmm.
And so your books are very beautiful, I have to say.
Well, thank you very much. I have a learning disability. So it's funny, I can write, but I can't read very well. And it's always been very hard for me. But now I have my computer will read to me. So that's really solved it. I just have the computer read, and I can edit by ear easily. So it's changed everything. I recommend it.
So technology does have its uses.
Mm-hmm.
So for those not familiar with you, Ken, can you talk a little bit about your garden and where you garden in the climate, the zone, the circumstances, maybe the soil conditions?
Well, I gardened in the Mid-Atlantic for many years. I gardened in New York City. first in Manhattan, and then I bought a house in Brooklyn, New York. They always say location, location, location. Well, I bought a really nice house in a terrible location, but it turned out to be great. So after 36 years, the the neighborhood changed.
Hmm.
So that was an investment that was really paid off. And I had a weekend place in the northwest corner of New Jersey in Zone 6A. It was 6A then. And that's where I would go on the weekends and garden. And that's 5 acres, but 2.5 acres are where I garden. And it's an island in a very small river. So I don't have a view, but it's very exciting. Exciting. Well, things happen when you're in a river.
Hmm.
There's, especially this year, we've had 4 floods. But so now I garden. Well, to go back to New York City. Well, I gardened in containers mostly, and in a backyard that was about 20 feet by 45 feet, and that's kind of a container in its own way. And now I'm on 2.5 acres of garden that's developed, and I garden here, and it's very different. But when I came here, it was so cold, but it's changed. It's not like it was. We used to go to -10 in the winter.
Wow.
And after about 8 years, we haven't been down below zero since then.
Hmm. And so the soil is very sandy, I'm imagining,
It is
being
very
being
sandy. It's
yeah.
actually the area is like Massachusetts. It's got that sort of those baby head rocks, like Connecticut. And but this place is sand because it's all reclaimed from the river, and it's not juicy like the Mississippi Delta. It's just sand. And so for years and years, I've been putting compost on the soil to incorporate it. And people told me years ago that it would disappear, and it does. It disappears. So I can have a flood, and the whole place could be underwater, and 3 days later, I have to water.
Wow. Yeah, the water holding capacity of sand is not very good.
Not good.
No.
Good drainage.
Yeah, great drainage. Any plant that says needs well draining soil. I imagine bulbs are doing well there.
You are completely correct. It's except we don't have sun because being at the bottom of a river, and we are 500 feet up. That's the elevation, but there's ridges on 2 sides and lots of trees. So I would call it a shade garden because the sun will get on the garden around 9 a.m. and off the garden around 4:30 p.m. So I can't grow tomatoes, for example. But now I'm growing tomatoes in raised beds on the road next to the mailbox. And I actually last year had tomatoes.
Wow. And what type of tomatoes were those?
That's a great question because I've been growing Juliet,
Mhm.
which is like a giant grape tomato or a tiny plum tomato, and it's fantastic. And you can use it for anything, and the skins are very thin. And I've always grown sun gold because I like
Mhm.
candy.
Oh, yeah. You have to have sun gold.
I tried some different ones and bigger ones, but Juliet is a complete winner.
Mm. So we'll have to check that one out. I've grown other plum and paste tomatoes, but not that one.
You will be surprised.
Nice. So let's turn to the topic of the episode, and that's making more plants. And you wrote a whole book on that, Ken. And so we're going to dive into some of those techniques. But the subtitle of that book was Making More Plants: The Science, Art, and Joy of Propagation. So I wanted to break down with you what is the science of it, what's the art, and what's the joy.
Oh, I think that's how I feel. Is that well, the science is that it happens, and of
Mm,
course, things like a seed sprouting, and it's very sensational, and I'm very keen on the science, and then learning new things too. But it just when the cells divide and you get roots and all that stuff is the science, and the art I think is the feeling of it, and feeling of nurturing, and you either have to have a sense of this whole thing, which is kind of common sense, or you develop it. Because, and you probably know this, a lot of
mhm.
gardening is common sense. green side up. That's what I used to say to people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe part of the art. And the joy is, well, I've got trees on this property, big trees that I planted from seed. And that's a joy. I think I got into gardening even as a kid because I love to nurture, like rescuing baby bunnies or something like, not that I did that, but that kind of thing. Or I've always had dogs.
Mm.
Just sharing a life with something that you can help thrive.
I totally agree, Ken. I think gardening is obviously nurturing. And I was going to say about the art of it, I think it's the feel
Hmm.
and maybe skill. Like some people are better at starting seeds indoors or better at direct sowing. You find what you're better at, right?
And you never stop learning,
Mm-hmm.
and often by mistakes. I love Jack in the Pulpits, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and you used to be able to buy a lot of different ones, but now that's different. But I can get seed from seed exchanges, some from England and different places, and when they're on a plant, they're in kind of berries. They're in a juicy berry that's red, and the berry is the inhibitor to the germination of the seed. So if you clean the fruit off of the seed and then sow them, they'll come up right away. And if you don't do that, they don't come up right away because they're used to being outdoors in the winter and the flesh disintegrates over the winter. But when you buy the seed because they can't ship the fruit, they come dry.
Hmm.
And I tried to germinate the dry seed for years. And finally, I tried to rehydrate the seed. And I talked to someone who's in the North American Rock Garden Society, and he said, "Oh, it's simple. You put them in water and you change the water 2 or 3 times a day for 2 weeks." And I thought, uh, well, he was retired.
Mm-hmm.
So I put some seeds. I've just done this too recently. I put some seeds in an organza bag that I got at a wedding, and I put it in the tank of the toilet. And so the water gets changed 3 or 4 or more times a day, fresh water with oxygen. And after 2 weeks, I sowed them and they came up.
Excellent. I love that MacGyver mentality of like, use what you have, right?
Yeah, I think that's part of gardening and certainly part of propagation.
Mm-hmm. So, being a gardener also means we're very acquisitive, as in we love to collect and have more plants than we can possibly do anything with.
Uh
Right?
oh.
Yes. So, I would say that's maybe our big overriding wanting to propagate more plants and have more of them. So let's go into some of the ways we can do that. And I love your example of the Erythema. And I was thinking about pawpaws too, that the pawpaw seed is similar, that it should never dry out and it's encased in that kind of like mucus membrane
Mhm.
around it. So that totally explains that and how it gets released and would naturally germinate. But before we go into seeds, maybe let's talk about the easiest way, I think, to make another plant, and that's to divide a plant that you have.
Hmm. Well, this is a great time of year to do that.
Hmm.
At this very moment, it's sort of almost over. But when plants are just about to break dormancy, maybe sometimes you see in books that they put garden forks back to back and squish the plants. And I don't do that generally, but I've also got that nice soft soil. But I'll dig up a whole plant, and it's like a pancake. And if it has fine roots, I can just take a serrated kitchen knife that I've dedicated to garden use and cut it in pie wedges and replant each piece. And then usually they equal the size that you started with by the end of the season. But if it's got thick roots, you want to shake it off and then you can pry it apart. But that's what I like to do is to dig up the plant, put it on a tarp, and knock off most of the soil and then transplant.
Hmm. And I think, your common plants to do that with would be hostas, daylilies. But I find, Ken, the toughest one to do that with is ornamental grasses because some of them are like, basically, you have to take a machete or a chainsaw.
Chainsaw, yeah, that's
Yeah.
and a backhoe.
Mhm. I always dread when somebody on my, garden list or neighborhood group says, "I just dug a clump of ornamental grass," and it's sitting out there. You can have
Mm,
part of it. I'm like, I don't know how you're gonna do that."
well, I mean, you can divide almost any perennial, and you mentioned hosta, that they're very self-contained, but I just divided some Uvularia grandiflora, which has lots of little shoots and very fine, hairy, fibrous roots. So it's like completely different from the hosta. But that's one that I might cut in wedges and replant the pieces. The
Mhm,
hosta, I might even wash off the roots to really see them and then pry it apart. And you can see where the crown is and where the new shoots are coming.
mhm.
Hosta is a good one to try because you can really see it.
Yeah, and I think irises, especially like the German bearded iris, as long as you have a little bit of that root chunk, that's
You have to do that with iris.
mhm,
They after like 3 years they just stop blooming really well. And I think I'm going to give up on Siberian iris because if you have a big clump of Siberian iris, the middle always dies, and they bloom for about 3 years, or that's been my experience. But I dig up that whole thing and then just pry off little pieces from around the edge. And you can dig up one plant of Siberian iris and end up really with 100 plants.
mhm. I think that's true of a lot of, especially the short-lived perennials like mums, where they start to die out in the center, and then you could just dig it out, discard that center, and take
Right,
wedges from the sides.
right.
Yeah, don't give up on that plant.
That's
Mhm,
something to do now, just when the new growth is just starting to appear. It's that period sort of ending, or you can do it in the fall when it's dormant, and you can do it actually almost any time. But it's really easy now because plants really want. That's one thing I'm thinking of just now. Plants want to live. They're on your side,
mhm,
and people don't really realize it. A lot of people are afraid to divide plants and stuff, but they're with you. You know what I mean?
mhm. Yeah, and I think it looks aggressive, when you're first time doing it and you're hacking at that or separating it and snapping off plant parts, but they really do appreciate, being thinned out sometimes and getting more room to grow.
Yep,
Hmm. And then you have more to share or pot up for your garden club's plant sale or give to another gardener.
exactly.
Hmm. So let's go on to sowing seeds.
Mm,
Which is I host an annual seed exchange. I just in love with that little packet that becomes a plant, that little tiny germination. So obviously there's sowing seeds, direct sowing into the soil outside, and then there's starting it indoors and then transplanting it out.
that's correct. um, I have a method of doing sowing seeds indoors, and it's not what everyone does. But and I, of course, will tell you about it. But I'm just saying that this is what I do.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean that everyone has to do this. And sometimes what I do is make community pots, and I never think of it as that, but that's what they call them. I'll take a 3.5 inch square pot because a square pot has more space in it than a round pot because of the corners, and I will sow one kind of seed in the pot, and then I will top dress that with grit, which is the kind I like is flaked granite, and they sell it because it's used in the poultry industry. Uh, because chickens need to have gravel in their gullets to process their food, but in like Maryland, sometimes it's clamshells, and you don't want oyster or clamshells. You want stone rock,
Hmm.
and it's really tiny. It's like or you can use horticultural sand, which is a giant sand. And the reason I'm saying this is I top dress everything with a very thin layer of grit. And for over 20 years, I have not had damping off once. And damping off is a series of fungal diseases. The seed germinates, it comes up, and then all of a sudden it keels over dead from fungus attacking right where the soil level is. But the grit is inert, and it also dries out very quickly. So it really changes the environment, and it's just a tip. But back to that community pot. So
Mm-hmm.
I've sowed. Let's say I've sowed. I don't know why they give you 500 seed in a packet or 100 seed when you want a tomato or 4 tomatoes. But maybe I've done 20 seeds of small seeds in a 3.5 inch pot. And then the other thing that they talk about is pricking out or prying up seedlings. And when you do it outdoors, they always say to kill every other seedling. And that's hard for me. I don't want to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
But I start them indoors in these small pots, and then instead of prying them up, which often damages them, I'll just knock the whole thing out of the pot, usually on its side, and then you can just peel up every germinated seedling. And you want to hold it by its first true leaf, the leaf that resembles the leaves that the plant will have when it's an adult, not those first seed leaves, because if a seed leaf is damaged, the plant it pretty much will die. So you want to hold it by the first true leaf, and you just peel them off the top. Zip zap, and nothing gets damaged. I know this is a podcast, so it's kind of hard maybe to picture that. I don't know if you're picturing what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very descriptive. Yeah, and it's such a delicate operation. You almost want to use tweezers, but I find your fingers are
And
just
we'll
fine.
do it. Yep.
Hmm.
And if it's generally, I'll bury a seed to a depth that's about equal to its thickness. I know some people bury them deeper, just as a sort of general idea. But if they're seeds like of poppies or uh, primroses, they're as fine as dust. So I'll sow them on the surface and not bury them at all. And those seeds usually need light too. So I can even sometimes sow them on top of the very thin layer of grit because they just sift down right to the soil. And I've had too much success. That's another issue when you end up with 30 primrose plants.
Mm-hmm. And so, how about when it calls for scarification or stratification?
If it calls for scarification, which is damaging the seed coat so that the moisture gets in faster, some things like morning glories, you can just soak them for 24 hours and it softens the seed coat. If it's a really hard seed coat, I'll take the seed and drag it across a piece of sandpaper. Sometimes people use razor blades or a file, but and I use razor blades for lots of things, but it's a little dangerous. But you could just take a sheet of sandpaper and scrape a seed on its side across it, and then you'll see that the coat sort of wears away, and you can often see white in that little space, and then the water will get in. So that's scarification, and stratification is using cold. And a lot of seeds need, well, perennials especially, they need to go through a winter.
Mm-hmm.
Often, if you read a lot about them, they will need warm, moist, followed by cold, moist, followed by warm, moist. And you think about it, that's outdoors. So the hardy perennials just want to be outdoors. But starting a few years ago, I started using the empty gallon milk jug technique, which you've probably talked to people about.
Hmm. So, also known as winter sowing.
Right, winter
Hmm.
sowing. And it's a miracle. So I let nature do it. I used to do the whole thing indoors, and the cool thing about it is, for example, with those Jack in the Pulpits, I could work to get or hellebores. I could get 2 years of growth in 1 year, but that's a whole nother thing about warm, cold, cold,
Hmm.
and warm, cold,
Hmm.
moist, cold, warm, moist, going back and forth. See, there's the science. It's just what's new.
And the art, I would say that too, getting the feel for that. And I think a lot of our native perennials especially need that kind of treatment.
Yeah, I always think of things that are juicy for some reason. But of course, there's all the meadow plants with
Mm-hmm.
dry seed, and you clean them and you can sow them. Most of them you can sow very close to the surface. Using the milk jug winter sowing technique, or doing them in a flat outdoors with like a cage over it in case you have chipmunks or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's great, and you sow it and forget it, and then in May there they are.
Mm-hmm. And that's how I also do, like, start my peas super early, like at the beginning of February, even earlier than is recommended.
Oh, really?
And I'll start them, but I'll put an empty tray on top because every squirrel and bird, as soon as those pea seedlings start to pop out, will, pluck those out readily.
Sometimes you can get a sort of like a waffle weave um, tray from a nursery,
Hmm.
and then the snow and the water and the rain will get in, but no critters will.
Exactly. Yeah. Those kind of almost woven plastic
Right,
trays.
right.
Those are the perfect ones to pin over the top, and I might even pin them down with a landscape staple because, or a rock or
Yeah,
something
I
just
put
to
a
weight it down.
brick on it usually.
Hmm. That helps a lot. So we could talk all episode about seed starting, but let's jump on to some other propagation techniques. And so the next one you talk about in the book is hunting and gathering, and I'm picturing this was what maybe our primordial ancestors did.
Well, I think today, when I was thinking about what we might talk about and thinking about hunting and gathering, I was thinking about those meadow plants and harvesting seed in the fall, just going around. I'm not into foraging so much for a lot of reasons, but if you're going to collect seed from a place that really is wild, just collect like one out of every six seeds, 1/6, because you want the seeds to be where they started and grow where they're liking to grow. But that's one thing about hunting and gathering. And with my Jack in the Pulpits, they make these clubs covered with berries, and so I harvest those, mostly collecting seed.
And so I was thinking in hunting and gathering also, our ancestors who collected seed to eat, and then they might bring it back to the cave or what have you with the hovel that they're growing. And,
Mhm.
and then a couple of those seeds fall onto the dirt floor and they germinate and then they make the connection there, right?
Yes.
So we're like, I feel like that was maybe the original way of gardening almost.
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly.
Hmm. I do feel like it's in our Jungian brain that we remember doing that. So it's almost instinctive to collect
Mhm.
seeds as you go along on a walk or you're gathering in the garden and plop some in your pocket. But how do you keep them straight, Ken? Because I know when I'm visiting other gardens and they offer me seeds, I'm like, I only have one or two baggies in my purse, maybe.
That's a good question. I have little envelopes, little white envelopes, but just like you said, that's what I do when I get home. But I've got, let's see, 5 pockets in my jeans, and so I do just what you do. I try to just keep them separate.
Hmm. I think today we have our cell phones too, and maybe I'll start
Take a
remembering to
picture.
take a picture
Yeah,
of the plant that it was gathered from and then the seed in my hand. And
yeah,
that,
that's great.
yeah, then we could put two and two together. But yeah, you usually come home with something in your pocket that you're like, I don't remember what
What
this
was
is.
that? Saying that, I'm just going to say, write it everything on a tag and stick it. You think I'm going to remember this? I'm sowing these seeds. I'll
Hmm.
remember, and I personally never remember. So get a tag, write the name on a tag, and tags. That's a whole nother thing because there's no great tag, but
Mm,
I do recommend pencil because a Sharpie, which a lot of people use, they fade in about a year in the sun, and that doesn't do you any good. But a
mm-mm.
pencil will last pretty much forever.
Yeah, I agree. Anything and taking a picture of it, like we said, with your cell phone or your digital camera, which whatever you have, that can also help that tag last because sometimes tags get lost.
And break. and
Hmm.
disintegrate.
And disintegrate
Yeah,
or get taken away by a hawk or a squirrel.
blue jays.
Yes.
In my Brooklyn garden, I don't know why they did it, but I, all the tags were pulled out almost every single winter by the blue jays.
Hmm.
You've probably heard horror stories like this, but a friend of mine had a garden tour, and during the tour, one of the visitors who had a little boy with her, the little boy presented all the tags, and the visitor said, "Oh, my son did this for you. He collected all these ugly tags." And there they were.
And thank you very much. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's happened to many of us. Hmm. So the next kind of plant propagation, I find it's kind of the next level up from beginning to maybe intermediate is vegetative reproduction.
Right. Well, when we were talking about seeds, that's sexual reproduction because
Hmm.
the seed is the product of the male pollen getting to the female egg and forming the seed. And vegetative reproduction is everything else, like cuttings and layering and uh, anything that uses a piece of the plant. And there's so many different ways of doing that. We talked about division. That's one kind of vegetative reproduction.
Hmm. Yeah, it's always fascinating to me because plants, I think, are the only organisms that you can do a piece of them, right, and make another whole plant. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think of it as like a treasure. It's the only collectible that you can share. You know, if you collect, I don't know, china or something, you can't really have an extra plate to share with a friend, but you can with and you have to with a special plant because you know you've heard probably lots of stories of people who lose their plants, and if they haven't shared it, they can't get it back. But if they have shared it, they can get it back.
Hmm. So, in vegetative reproduction, basically cloning the
Right.
same plant, so you
Yeah.
know it's going to be the same thing.
Well, if we think about cuttings, for example, there's lots of different kinds of cuttings, and they're all based on the time of year and the condition of the cutting. So there's what's called softwood cuttings and semi-ripe cuttings and hardwood cuttings, and they're all treated differently. And I think softwood cuttings are wonderful and easy, but a lot of the books say that hardwood are the easiest cuttings to do, and that's because you can do it and forget them
Hmm.
for a year or two. But I like I like to watch it with a softwood cutting. Some cuttings will root in 3 weeks, and it's what a thrill.
And for our listeners, can you define the difference between the softwood and the hardwood? So that would be as it's growing early in the season would be the
Mm-hmm.
softwood.
Yeah, the softwood is new growth, and you can sort of tell the part of the plant that you want to make the cutting from. It's usually the place where the green part of the new stem starts to turn the color of the mature stem, which might be brown. You can also sometimes, just to get a feel for it, if you take the stem, probably a 3 node long, 3 inch stem, and if you try to break it, if you bend it and it bends and in a curve, it's too young. If it bends in a crease, it's too old. But if it snaps, that's the place for the cutting. That's the length for the cutting, which is usually about 3 nodes long. Depending on the plant, it could be 2 inches or it could be 4 inches. But usually that's something that happens in, I'd guess, mid spring, late spring. Here it's usually the middle of May. And
Hmm.
I'll go around in the morning when the plants have lots of moisture in them, just like when you cut flowers. And I'll go with a bucket of water and make my cuttings and stick them in the water and then process them later. But once you get the idea of how old the cutting is, you've got it. And you know where to take almost all of your cuttings
Hmm.
of softwood cuttings.
Hmm.
That's the first one. The hardwood cuttings you take in winter. late autumn to winter, and they're woody. And they often, well, you take them when they're dormant, they don't have any leaves. And you take a cutting, I take them usually about 6 inches long, 6 to 8 inches long. And you have to, this is important with every single cutting, you have to remember the polarity. It's sky side up, earth side down.
Mm.
And if you mess that up, it's not going to work, believe it or not. So I will often mark an arrow right on, especially with the hardwood cuttings, because you can't tell which end is which. I'll mark an arrow of which is the sky end. Sometimes I make a diagonal cut at the top for the sky end and a straight cut at the bottom for the earth end, because that's how you're going to have to do it. And in most cases, you need a hormone, either a liquid or a powder rooting hormone, and you dip the earth end in the hormone. And usually, what I do is I'll bury the entire stick in damp sand and forget it in like a plastic shoebox or something like that and cover it. Years ago, and also professionals who needed a lot of them, they would cut lots of these sticks, dig a hole 3 feet deep, bury the cuttings, and then top the whole thing with bales of hay.
Huh.
And then 2 years later, dig them up and have rooted cuttings.
Wow.
But I just do it. I'll get a plastic shoebox or something. That's what I did this year.
Hmm.
And I stick the cuttings in the damp sand and I'll check them around now. Some of them have calluses and some of them have roots. First, they form a callus, which is kind of a distorted growth at the earth end, and then roots actually grow through the callus. And when the roots are about 1 inch long, pot them up. Sometimes people leave roots too long, and if you like do willows in water, if you let them in the water more than 1 inch long, they'll rot.
Hmm.
So you got to pot them up at 1 inch. That's what I say.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of letting the roots get too long and then they form those water loving roots and they don't succeed after
Yeah,
that.
they can't.
Hmm.
Uh, they're used to getting oxygen out of water, and then they
Hmm.
have to change. But usually, for me, they rot.
Oh,
They
yeah.
they start to turn color, and then the tips rot, and that's sort of it.
Hmm.
I can't tell you how many times I've done that.
And I'm thinking the classic plant for that hardwood cutting that you described would be a fig. That would be probably
Oh,
your
that's
easiest.
the
Yeah.
easiest. Yeah,
Hmm.
you can't go wrong with a fig. Earth end though.
And definitely people love getting a rooted fig cutting. Um, I know I would welcome one from anyone's garden.
I just did 2 weeks ago. I did some figs, and
Hmm.
I took my fig that I store over the winter in a very cold place, but not freezing, and I took it out, and I thought this thing is scraping the ceiling. I mean, it's only a 4 foot ceiling,
Yeah.
so I cut the tips, and they with the hormone, and they went into a plastic box. And those, usually I keep them cold, hardwood cuttings, like the people who buried them in the garden, so they're 50 degrees for the whole winter.
Mm.
But with figs, you can actually keep them warm because they're gonna make roots really fast. That's a good one to start with because
Mhm.
that's nothing succeeds like success, people say,
Mhm.
and it is so exciting.
Yeah, and very encouraging to see those first leaves that leafing out, if I can say that.
Mhm.
And that brings us to propagating vegetatively through leaves. So taking some cuttings of leaves might be with a begonia or similar plant, African violet. Do you do a lot of that, Ken?
I used to, and I'll still do. Well, I was going to say I'll still do succulents, but sometimes succulents do it themselves. When a leaf breaks off some small leafed, fleshy succulent and hits the soil, and then it roots and makes a baby plant. Uh, I I would do. I used to do it with Rex begonias and rhizotomous begonias. There's all sorts of plants now. People grow those zigzag plants that I've never grown one of those, but I was just reading that you can grow those from leaves.
Mhm.
So you you tear off or break off carefully a leaf and stick that cut part into the medium that you're going to use for rooting, which we didn't talk about yet. And you put probably about 3/4 of an inch of that leaf in that medium. In the case of uh, begonia, you lay a whole leaf on the surface of your rooting medium. And then what I would do is pin them with hairpins.
Mm-hmm.
Some people make little cuts, but you want it to have contact with the medium. And the medium that I use for rooting almost exclusively is perlite.
Mm.
100% perlite, which is not the same as vermiculite.
No.
But I keep the perlite moist, has lots of oxygen. And before I put any cutting in, I will tamp the moist perlite down so that it's almost a solid block. Like if it's in a pot, I could turn the pot upside down and it won't even fall out. And then I'll drill a hole in it with a pencil and stick my cutting in, because I find that the contact with the cutting really speeds it up.
Mm-hmm.
It might be because it's irritated, or maybe it's just moisture. The nice thing about perlite is it's got oxygen, and it'll hold moisture, and it'll always have oxygen. So it's really on your side. But I do almost everything in perlite except for those hardwood cuttings that I do in sand or cover in sand.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of 100% perlite. I've usually used, a seed starting mix that has perlite in it, but that's a great tip.
And I just did some Rose of Sharon cuttings because I have a Rose of Sharon that isn't on the market anymore. It's a single white one, and now the double white one is all you see. But a friend of mine wanted the single white one, and I've got it. And it's also almost sterile, so it blooms for a really long time with big white hibiscus.
Mm.
And it's pretty easy to do from hardwood. So I took the cuttings in late fall when the leaves dropped, and now I've got 6 plants to give her.
Well, let's go on to our next technique, and that is layering, or sometimes called air layering.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about easy. Layering is pretty easy. And plants do want to live. There's ground layering and there's air layering, like you said. Ground layering, if you have something like a clematis or a vine outdoors, you can take the vine and you want to damage it just a little bit at the nodes. I'll just make a little cut with a sharp knife, not cut through the whole thing, just make a little damage. You can sometimes just wiggle it around and bend it a little bit. And then I'll peg each of those nodes, plant nodes where the leaves come out, to the soil, and maybe cover it with a rock. And just you do that when it's an active growth, depending on the kind of clematis. And then you come back and it's got roots. You could even just leave it for a whole year.
Oh, yeah.
But that's ground layering, and that's really simple. If you can maybe bend even a shrub that has a long cane down to the ground. Air layering, you damage the stem in one way or another. What I would do is make little cuts on the side of something like a rubber tree plant and stick in a piece of a matchstick or something to keep that open, maybe use a little hormone, and then you wrap it in a material like whole sphagnum moss, and then wrap that in plastic to keep it moist. And in about 3 months or so, it will have roots. And if you use clear plastic, you can see the roots. And then you cut that off and pot it up, and you have a new plant. And I don't know if you could picture that from that description.
I think so. And I think a lot of us have been in somebody's garden and we saw this little plastic covered bump on a shrub or a fruit tree. And you're like, what is that? Like, you just assume it's for repairing a plant part, some type of plant surgery, but that's actually the air layering technique.
Or some kind of animal.
Mm-hmm.
Some kind of nest.
Yeah. And I agree with you that layering, especially on the ground layering, is so easy. I've had many shrubs just do it themselves. I've had hydrangeas tip in. Forsythia, that's one that just prolifically layers itself.
Talking about all this stuff, it sounds like, well, first of all, when we leave, I'll be going outside to start doing something. But it's so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Especially when you pull back, say, the mulch in the spring and you find that it's made a baby. I just found that with my PJM rhododendron. So I saw it layered itself, made a little baby to the side. I snipped that off and potted that up, and that'll be coming to my garden club's plant sale.
that's great because rhododendron are not so easy to root from
Yeah,
cutting. So
I
you
was
got it
happy about that one. I said, yay, I didn't do anything, and nature did it for me.
with you.
With me. Exactly, Ken. All right, so our last propagation technique is grafting, and I think this one can trip some people up. We did an episode on the Garden DC podcast about fruit tree grafting in
Mhm.
particular, but maybe we can just give the basics of grafting here.
Well, on Instagram, I see these ads for grafting tools and stuff, and they it looks like they're trying to attach a maple tree to a fig tree, and that's I don't think that's going to work. You really want
Yeah.
to stick with the same kind of plant, and uh, whether it's a fruit tree or something like that, and you want the same size. So when you're grafting, you have to line up the growing part of the plant of the new plant to the growing part of what's going to be the understock. And usually people will just grow some kind of fruit tree from seed, and that'll be the understock. And then you get the variety you want to grow or multiple varieties that you want to grow, and you graft it. And I would say to anybody, if you want to graft, go see somebody do it or take a course or maybe a YouTube video or something. You really need to see it done, I think. And it's great if you can find somebody who does it and is good at it.
Mhm.
And the mystery is kind of solved. I think grafting is well for me. Grafting is hard for me,
Mhm. I
and
agree. I think it's one of those things like rose pruning that the first time it's great to do it with an expert and be
mhm,
there and watch their hands and do that in person, and then you get the hang of it.
right. Seeing is believing.
Mhm. Much easier sometimes to and then do a few yourself with that person and
Well,
let
that's
them
great.
watch. Yeah, and that's the best way to learn.
So when are we going to do that?
Yes. I was going to say for our last topic, as garden communicators, we should definitely talk about when it is not okay to propagate a plant. And when would that be, Ken?
Oh, you mean like if it's a patented plant?
Hmm.
Well, people think it's like the label on a mattress. Do not remove, penalty of death if you remove the label from the pillow. But that's not exactly what that means. And I'm saying that because you can propagate a plant that you own. You
Hmm.
just can't sell that plant. And you really shouldn't even give it away. But to be super safe and best, just don't do it.
Hmm.
Plants that are patented are protected by law and they're not to be reproduced, mostly not to be reproduced for sale. But as I said, you can make one version of it for yourself. Just don't give it away.
Hmm. And those patents aren't forever. I think a lot of them are a 10 or 20-year period.
Mm,
So
yeah.
if there's something you really wanted to pass along, say, to a grandchild or something, and you've had a rose in your garden for 30 plus years, you're probably on the
Um,
safe side for that one.
well, and you make me think of something else, which is trademark,
Mhm.
because it makes me so angry when a plant, especially a species, gets a fancy name by some big company and then they've trademarked it and you think, oh, I can't reproduce this because it's trademarked. But that's just the name. That's not a patent.
Mhm.
And when they take a plant, like I have a kind of Robinia pseudoacacia, and a big company decided to name it. I think they named it Twisty Baby
Mm.
because it's contorted. And I thought, Twisty Baby, give me a break. I've been growing this plant for 30 years.
Mhm.
So just
Exactly.
remember that a registration or registered or it's different than a patent.
Mhm. And you'll know it because it'll usually say PPAF after the name on the tag, which means plant patent applied for.
Applied for,
Yep.
right.
So you'll look for that. That's usually new stuff or again, registered. So, but otherwise, if it was a pass along plant to you, you're probably safe passing that on to others.
Yeah, that's right. Just don't sell a patented plant.
Exactly.
And I guess beware of propagating poison ivy
Hmm.
because you might not want to. Even though I'm very fond of poison ivy,
Hmm.
actually.
So, how can listeners contact you to find out more, Ken?
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. Well, I've been doing courses with my friend Margaret Roach, who's a very well-known garden writer, and I meant to tell people this when we were talking about seeds, especially vegetable seeds. On her website, which is A Way to Garden, and if you go to awaytogarden.com slash, I think, I wish I knew what it was. It might be, I'm going to think of this in a second.
Hmm.
But she's got on her website, she has a calculator. That's what I think it's slash calculator. And it tells you when in your zone to start just about every plant. And this is so helpful. So you just look at your list, and if you're in zone 7, it says to plant your tomato seeds indoors April 5th and outdoors, whenever. So that's one thing. But my website is just simply kendruse.com, KENDRUSE, altogether.com. It's got pictures of my garden here on the island, and I'll post some kind of story or something. Right now, I think I still have winter sowing there with the jug, and I better update that. And it has a way to contact me too. But these courses that we've been doing, Margaret and I, we do about 3 a year, and they're 4 or 5 sessions each one, and they have been really popular. It's great. So we'll answer some questions. People send in pictures, and we usually cover about 5 topics. This new session starting on just this month, and we have tomato troubles and making mosaics of ground covers, compost 2.0, and the advanced questions. And I'm going to do a little thing on dividing plants with video. So I illustrate everything. We have photographs and videos, and it's great. It's great to share.
Awesome. I think I'm going to have to sign up for that ground cover mosaic one because of my recent book on ground covers. I think that will be great to recommend to people.
Oh, that's good. It's for if you want to see that whole thing, it's awaytogarden.com/joined. Join, and you don't have to join, but it tells you all about
Hmm.
the different courses that we have, and they're all live.
Excellent.
Like it's called the Virtual Garden Club. It is a club. We have we have a Facebook page that
Hmm.
people talk to each other, and I learned something.
Hmm. Those sharing groups are always the best. And in our last minute together, Ken, do you have any final thoughts on making more plants?
Do it. Just do it. It I find it so thrilling, especially when you have a new plant or when you accidentally discover something. I sowed a whole lot of seeds from a wonderful maple, and one of them is dwarf. Just surprising. So I've got this 20-year-old, 3 foot tall dwarf Japanese maple, and it just happened to happen. That happens with hostas too. I've gotten variegated hostas just from sowing a lot of seed. I mean, really, it's so thrilling. So do it, and you will succeed through trial and error. That's what I know. Don't be afraid to fail. That's how one way you learn.
Hmm. So true, Ken. Thank you so much for being on the Garden DC podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for asking.
Iphion plant profile. Iphion uniflorum, is a flowering bulb that blooms in early spring. The flowers are typically pale blue white or pink. It's also known as starflower, Mexican star, spring star, and star likes. It's a South American native where it's used as a ground cover plant. Iphion grows to about 10 inches high. The Latin name and classification have changed several times for Iphion. Pollinators are crazy for it. The flowers are sweetly scented, but the grass-like foliage smells like garlic when crushed, which makes it deer and rabbit resistant. It is hardy to USDA zones 5 to 9. Iphion prefers full to part sun and slightly moist soils. It is fairly drought tolerant, so does well in rock gardens and in containers. You can purchase the bulbs and plant them in the fall. It looks great in combination with daffodils and tulips. This is also an old-fashioned pass-along plant. Bulbs can be dug and divided shortly after the flowers fade. It will self-seed and naturalize in lawn areas, then dies back by mid-spring. Iphion is also a good cut flower, and it's easy to use for bulb forcing, too. Iphion, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, in my home garden, my redbud tree is starting to pop open with all those pretty little blooms along the branches and trunk. Over at the community garden, we've planted radish and carrot seeds and are checking on our garlic. And up next, we plan to plant our potatoes. I still haven't seen the pea seedlings emerge yet, but hopefully they'll show up soon. This week's garden tasks that we shared on our social media channels include looking out for chickweed and henbit and weeding those out as soon as you see them before they set seed, and also painting your tool handles in a bright color such as red, so when you put them down in the garden, they don't get lost amongst all the greenery. The March issue of Washington Gardener magazine is out, and inside we have several stories that you might be interested in reading. You can check out the issue at washingtongardener.blogspot.com. We have a story on the Ames Haskell Azalea collection at the National Gallery of Art, a profile of Dr. Susan Barton, an extension specialist and professor at University of Delaware who's doing some really interesting work, a plant profile of Amur Adonis, homemade violet syrup recipe, so you can get out there in the garden now, collect those wild violets, and make that yummy syrup for yourself, and lots more inside that issue. Local gardening events that you might want to attend or check out include the April 15th meeting of the Silver Spring Garden Club at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland. That features a talk on growing camellias in our region by Lenka Lunston, co-president of the Camellia Society of the Potomac Valley. And you can find out more about that at silverspringgardenclub.com. Another meeting you might want to attend if you're in the Washington, D.C. area is the Tacoma Hort Club's membership meeting on Wednesday, April 17th. And you can find out details about that at tacomahort.org. It's a green evening with a panel of local groups focused on environmental sustainability issues, and that takes place in downtown Tacoma Park, Maryland at Historic Tacoma's building there. And our friends at Community Forklift are hosting a garden pop-up the weekend of April 19th through 22nd. And there will be deals on garden tools, pots, decor, and more. And they'll be focusing on releasing fresh batches of garden supplies and restocking the items every day. So come and visit a few times during the event. Some are used. You can also donate some of your tools and garden items to the sale as well to support them. And keep those out of the landfill waste and conserve our natural resources. You can find out details about Community Forklift in Edmonston, Maryland at communityforklift.org. And the final event I want you to check out is the Potomac Rose Society's meeting on Sunday, April 21st at 2 p.m. This is a virtual meeting held via Zoom, and it is featuring beautiful gardens of England, especially those legendary rose gardens that we've heard so much about, from Hidcote Manor to Sissinghurst Castle, and that is free and open to the public. You just need to register for that at potomacriose.org, and consulting Rosarians earn a credit toward the recertification for attending this program, so that is a wonderful opportunity for further education. Happy gardening!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the Urban Garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org. Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with the new book Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional, everyday grass lawn. In the last 3 years alone, over 23 million American adults converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now are looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn is knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Author Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the details on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Available at bookstores now and also at Quarto.com, where you can get 30% off using discount code GARDENING30.
This is Christy Page with Food Gardening Network with the last word on sharing is caring, or at least that's what my dogs think. My dogs love fruits and vegetables. They would eat them all day long if given a chance. Every time I take out the cutting board, they're eagerly at attention hoping for some scraps. I tell myself that when they are sitting there looking at me with longing, they're not actually begging, they're just watching intently so that I don't hurt myself. They are so predictable. The cutting board is placed on the counter, the veggies are taken out of the drawers, and the pitter-patter of paws across the kitchen floor can be heard. This doesn't happen when I'm slicing bread. They don't care. They want the crunchy, yummy goodness of fresh fruits and veggies. I've heard of teenagers eating you out of house and home, but dogs eating you out of fresh produce? That was new to me, but that is exactly what has happened in our home over the past few years, so I decided to get creative. I started doing a lot of research on what dogs can and cannot eat for people's food. The ASPCA was a huge source of information. I also checked with our vet to ask what she thought was best for our furry friends. To my surprise, a lot of my favorite fruits and veggies were also healthy options for my pets. I no longer had to feel guilty about the longing eyes as I pulled out the cutting board. I was able to share with them They love getting the ends off of carrots when I'm chopping them up for soups or stir fries. They are so very excited to get a slice of apple when I'm prepping pies, before adding the sugar and cinnamon, of course. And they're also so very, very happy that I add green beans to their food dish on Sundays. My dogs may be a little bit spoiled, but I feel like they are now invested in our gardening adventure. When they're out in the yard with me, they will go over and sniff the plants. They are constantly checking on the progress of all of our great fruits and vegetables. They know better than to try to eat anything off the vine, though. They have to wait until I get that cutting board out before they get their portion. If you had told me a year ago that my dogs would be interested in my gardening adventures, I would have thought that you were crazy. But now that they get so many fresh, great treats, they are very interested. After all, sharing is caring. So, if you are like me and are already thinking about what you can plant in your garden for this year, you may want to keep your furry friends in mind. This has been The Last Word on Sharing is Caring with Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.blogspot.com. Thank you. You can find and follow Washington Gardener on Twitter /X, Instagram, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. Please take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Spotify and Apple. Open the Spotify or Apple app, search for GardenDC, check on the rate button, and select 5 stars.